The laughter was the cruelest part. It rattled the saloon's grimy windows and echoed off the bald-faced bluffs that ringed the town of Dustfall. It was a mean, jagged sound, the kind men make when they found a creature weaker than themselves. Silas stood on the splintered boardwalk, the target of it all. He was a large man, not with the hard-packed muscle of a brawler, but with a flesh that spoke of hiding, not feasting. A man softened by disuse. His mail-order suit, bought with the last of his money, strained at the seams, a testament to a hope that had been foolishly mismeasured. The telegram had promised a bride. Instead, it delivered a punchline. The intended woman, a rancher's daughter, had taken one look at him and burst into a fit of giggles, her father paying the saloon patrons for the joke. Now, they were deciding his fate like a stray dog. A hard-faced man named Jeb, the town's self-appointed wit, shoved Silas forward. "What are we gonna do with this hog? Can't ship him back more laughter." Silas's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a brand. He kept his eyes on the muddy street, on the way the horse manure and slush froze in the ruts. He'd known this was a mistake. A desperate prayer sent into the void, answered by mockery. Then, a new voice cut through the noise, low and sharp. "Give him to the widow." The laughter died instantly, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. The name hung in the frigid air like a curse. Ilara. The woman who lived at the edge of everything, the edge of town, the edge of society, the edge of endurance. The infertile widow whose husband had wrapped his wagon around an oak tree a year prior. She was an omen, a ghost who walked in daylight. Jeb's grin turned venomous. Perfect. A barren woman and a fattened calf. Maybe they'll make a new kind of misery together. He grabbed Silas by the collar and hauled him down the street, the crowd following at a distance, eager to see the final act of their cruel play. Ilara's cabin was small, hunkered down against a line of skeletal pines, a thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney like a final, fading breath. She stood on the porch, a shotgun held loosely in one hand. She was thin, worn down by grief and hardship, but her eyes held a stillness that unnerved the boisterous men. They held the permanent winter of the mountains behind her. Jeb shoved Silas forward. He stumbled, catching himself on the porch steps. "Here's your new man, Ilara." A gift from the good people of Dustfall. Silas finally looked up, meeting her gaze. He expected the same disgust, the same derision. He saw neither. He saw a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like recognition, a shared understanding of being the butt of a cosmic joke. She looked not at his size, but at the deep, hollowed-out shame in his eyes. Her gaze was level, her voice quiet but firm, carrying over the wind. Leave him. It wasn't a request. The men shuffled, their sport soured by her lack of reaction. They drifted away, their laughter now thin and uncertain. Silas was left on her porch, a parcel delivered to the wrong address. Behind her skirts, a small boy with wide, haunted eyes peeked out. He clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Ilara simply nodded toward the open door. "The wind has teeth today," she said. It was an invitation. An acceptance. He stepped inside, out of the cold, and for the first time in years, the crushing weight on his soul felt a fraction lighter. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It filled the corners, settled in the rafters, and lay between them like a thick wool blanket. For days, they moved around each other in a careful, quiet orbit. Silas slept on a pallet by the hearth, the fire his only real companion in the night. The boy, Leo, never spoke. He watched Silas with an unnerving intensity, his small hand always clutching the wooden bird as if it were an anchor in a silent, violent sea. Silas learned their routine without a word being exchanged. He chopped wood, his axe strokes falling with a heavy, rhythmic purpose that seemed to shake the rust from his bones. The pile of split logs grew into a fortress wall against the encroaching winter. He repaired the leaky roof, his large hands surprisingly nimble. He mucked out the small shed that housed their single, bony goat. He worked from dawn until his muscles screamed and his mind was too tired for the ghosts that usually plagued him. Ilara would leave a plate of stew or jarny cakes on the table for him. She never sat with him. She mended clothes by the firelight, her fingers moving with a practiced economy. He would watch the light play on her worn face, seeing the geography of a pain far deeper than his own. He was a joke to the world, but in this small, silent space, he was simply a presence. A pair of hands. A body that radiated heat into the cold room. He was useful, and that was a feeling he had long forgotten. He started leaving small things for her on the porch, a perfectly shaped piece of kindling, a handful of pine nuts he'd found. She never acknowledged them, but the next day they would be gone. One evening, a blizzard descended, burying the world in a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf. Inside, the fire spat and crackled, a lone beacon of defiance. Leo coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook his small frame. By midnight, he was burning with fever. Ilara's stoic calm finally fractured. Her hands trembled as she wiped his brow with a damp cloth. Silas watched her, the raw terror in her eyes a mirror of a memory he fought daily to suppress. He stood up, his large frame casting a long shadow. "Boil water," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She stared at him. He moved to his pack, the one he'd carried into town, and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside were dried herbs. Willow bark, yarrow, elderflower. "My mother was a healer," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. It was the most he'd said about himself since arriving. He prepared the tea, his hand steady, his movements sure. He coaxed the boy to drink, his voice a low, soothing rumble. He sat with Leo through the night, changing the compresses, whispering nonsensical, comforting things. Ilara watched from her chair, the shotgun across her lap, a silent guardian over them both. As dawn broke, the fever did too. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world pristine and still. Leo was sleeping peacefully, his breathing even. Ilara looked at Silas, her eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude. It was something deeper, more elemental. She finally saw the man, not the prank. "Thank you," she whispered. The two words were a bridge across the chasm of their silence. Trust began not with a grand gesture, but with small, shared duties. He'd fetch the water, and she'd have the fire going. She'd patch a tear in his shirt, and he'd reshoe the goat. They spoke little, but a language was forming between them, a language of shared burdens and quiet acknowledgements. He learned the story of Leo's silence not from her words, but from the way she would flinch if he raised a hand too quickly to scratch his head, the way the boy would hide when a stranger's horse rode past on the distant track. This was a family forged in the aftermath of violence. He began to feel a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness for them. They were his to watch over. The prank had stranded him here, but he was starting to think of the cabin not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. The weight he carried on his frame began to shift, to harden. The long hours of chopping wood were carving away the soft edges of his past life, revealing something older and harder beneath. One afternoon, while splitting a stubborn round of oak, he felt eyes on him. He looked up to see a man on horseback at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the pines. The man was gaunt, with a cruel slash of a mouth. He watched Silas for a long moment, a look of slow, dawning recognition on his face. Then, he smiled, a chilling, predatory thing, and spurred his horse back toward town. Silas's blood ran cold. The axe felt heavy and foreign in his hands. He knew that face. Caleb. A dog who ran with Ronan's pack. The past he had buried under years of shame and distance had just found his address. He stood frozen, the silence of the woods suddenly filled with the ghosts of gunfire and screams. He had thought Dustfall was the end of the world, a place to disappear. He was wrong. It was just another stop on a map his demons already knew by heart. He looked toward the cabin, where Ilara was hanging laundry, the simple domestic act a stark contrast to the violence churning in his gut. He had brought the wolves to her door. The thought was more terrifying than any threat to his own life. That evening, he couldn't eat. The stew sat untouched, growing cold. Ilara watched him, her brow furrowed. The quiet comfort of their routine was gone, replaced by a thrumming tension. "What is it?" she finally asked, her voice soft. He looked from her to the sleeping boy, the fierce love in her gaze a thing he felt he had no right to stand near. "A man I used to know," he said, the words tasting like ash. His in town her expression didn't change, but her hand went to the worn stock of the shotgun resting against the wall. "Does he mean you harm?" Silas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for a decade. "He means everyone I'm near harm." The arrival of Caleb shattered the fragile peace of the cabin. Silas became a sentry, his night spent not by the fire, but by the window, watching the moonlit snow for movement. The rhythm of his axe became faster, more frantic, as if he could chop his way through the fear. He saw the way Elara watched him, her own fear present but controlled. She didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer, but she started keeping the shotgun loaded and close at hand. She was readying for a fight, his fight, and the realization lodged itself deep in his chest, a painful, warming thing. He knew he had to leave. To run again, to draw the threat away from them. But the thought of leaving the warmth of that cabin, the quiet strength of Elara, the silent trust of Leo, it was an amputation he wasn't sure he could survive. He owed her the truth. One night, as the fire burned low, casting their faces in flickering shadow, he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, pulling words from a place he'd walled off long ago. "My name isn't Silas," he began. She just listened, her hand still. "It's Saul Thorne. They used to call me the Ox." He told her of the gang, led by a man named Ronan, a man whose charisma was matched only by his cruelty. They weren't just thieves, they were predators. "We took a bank," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire. "A town in the Nebraska territories. It went wrong. A clerk, he had a family." Ronan didn't care. The memory was vivid, sharp, the smell of gunpowder, the shattering glass, the look on the clerk's face. "I left that night. Took my share and vanished. I've been hiding ever since." Became Silas. Grew soft. Hoped the world would forget the Ox ever existed. When he finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. He had laid his ugliest sins at her feet, fully expecting her to cast him out. He wouldn't blame her. He deserved it. Elara was quiet for a long time. Then she rose, went to the small cupboard, and brought back a tin box. She opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of her with a handsome, smiling man, and a single, formal letter. "My husband, William," she said softly. "He didn't die in a wagon accident. He drank. And when he drank, he hit. He blamed me for the silence in this house, for the emptiness of my womb." She traced the edge of the letter. "Leo is my sister's boy. William, he went to her house one night. In a rage. My sister didn't survive. Leo saw it all. That's why he doesn't speak." She looked up at him, her eyes clear of judgment. "We all have ghosts, Saul. The question is whether we let them hunt us, or we turn and face them." In that moment, he was no longer Silas the prank or Saul the Ox. He was just a man with a haunted past, sitting across from a woman with her own. And they were no longer alone. The next day, Caleb returned. He didn't hide this time. He rode his horse right into the middle of the clearing, stopping just out of easy rifle range. His smirk was visible even from the cabin door. "Ronan sends his regards, Ox," he yelled, his voice slick with menace. "Says your share has earned a lot of interest. He's coming to collect." Silas stepped onto the porch, placing himself between the man and the door. Elara was right behind him, the shotgun in her hands. She wasn't trembling. Her face was set like stone. "There's nothing for him here," Silas called back, his voice a low growl. "Tell him to move on." Caleb laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Oh, I don't think so. He's real interested in your new setup. A ready-made family. He likes things like that. Things he can break." He let the threat hang in the air, then slowly turned his horse and trotted away. The casual cruelty of it was worse than an open attack. It was a promise. That night, Silas didn't go to his pallet. He sat at the table, cleaning his own pistol, a relic from his past he'd kept buried at the bottom of his pack. The movements were automatic, familiar. Ilara came and sat opposite him, cleaning the shotgun. Leo was asleep in the small adjoining room, the carved bird on the pillow beside his head. "You could run," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Draw them away." "I've been running for 10 years, he replied, his voice rough. "Running is what brought them here." "I'm done running." He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, the strength in her worn hands. "This is the first place that's felt like anything." "I'm not letting him take it." "We won't let him take it," she corrected him softly. The word "we" landed between them, solid and unbreakable. A bond forged not of vows or promises, but of shared wounds and a mutual, desperate need to protect the little light they had found in the darkness. He knew then that he would die here before he let Ronan's shadow fall across her or the boy. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but for the first time, it was overshadowed by something else. A purpose. He wasn't just Saul Thorne, the killer running from his past. He was Silas, the man who chopped the wood, who fixed the roof, who would stand as a wall between this family and the coming storm. They knew they couldn't just wait. They needed supplies, and they needed an ally. The next morning, under a sky the color of lead, they hitched the goat to a small cart and headed into Dust Fall. Silas walked beside it, his pistol tucked into his belt, his eyes scanning the rooftops. Ilara sat on the cart, Leo nestled beside her, the shotgun resting across her lap. The townspeople watched them pass, their whispers following them like carrion crows. The prank was no longer funny, it was terrifying. They had tied their pariah to a ghost, and now his demons were coming for them all. Their destination was the blacksmith shop, run by an old man named Abe. He was a gnarled, quiet man who had always shown Ilara small kindnesses, a mended bucket at no charge, a kind word when no one else would speak to her. Abe watched them approach, his face grim. He'd heard the talk. He'd seen Caleb. He ushered them into the back of his forge, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. "Ronan's got 5 men with him," Abe said, his voice a low rumble. "Hold up at the saloon. Bragging about what he's going to do to you, Thorne." And to her he nodded at Ilara, his eyes full of a grim respect. Silas's jaw clenched. "I need ammunition." "Whatever you've got." Abe didn't hesitate. He went to a heavy wooden chest and pulled out several boxes of cartridges. "This is for a Winchester." Got it off a trapper. He pushed them across a workbench. "And this." He handed Silas a heavy Navy Colt, its metal cool and solid. "It's seen some work, but it's true." Silas checked the action. It was smooth. "I can't pay you for this, Abe." "Consider it a town tax," the old blacksmith grunted. "You're doing a job no one else has the stomach for. Get rid of them." He looked at Ilara, and his voice softened. "You take that boy and you keep him safe. This town owes you better than it gave you." As they left, Abe's final words followed them out into the cold. "Ronan's not a man who just kills you, son. He likes to burn down everything you love first." The words were a prophecy, and Silas knew the fire was coming. He looked at Ilara, at her unyielding strength, and he knew they would face the flames together. The storm broke just after dusk, a physical manifestation of the violence that was coming. Snow began to fall, thick and heavy, driven by a wind that shrieked around the corners of the cabin. It was a perfect night for an attack, the blizzard providing cover, the noise masking their approach. Inside, the cabin was a small fortress of lamplight and resolve. Silas had barred the door and shuttered the windows, leaving only small slits to see through. Ilara had moved Leo, still sleeping, into the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, wrapping him in every blanket they owned. He was safe from stray bullets there. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence inside was a stark contrast to the fury of the storm outside. Every creak of the logs, every howl of the wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. Silas stood by the front window, Winchester in hand. Ilara manned the small window at the back, her shotgun ready. They were 2 points of a desperate triangle, guarding their small world. The first shot came without warning, a deafening crack that shattered the night. Wood splintered next to Silas's head. The siege had begun. Shadows moved in the swirling snow, wraith-like figures flitting between the trees. A second shot, and a third. They were testing the defenses. Silas didn't fire back. Ammunition was too precious. He waited, his breath pluming in the cold air, his heart a steady, heavy drum against his ribs. He was the ox again, but this time, the purpose was different. It wasn't greed. It was protection. A face appeared at the back window, a bearded man trying to pry the shutter loose. Ilara didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, the blast echoing like thunder in the small space. The face disappeared with a choked scream. One down. They were committed now. There was no retreat. Shouts erupted from the darkness. A fusillade of bullets tore into the cabin walls, punching holes through the logs, sending splinters flying. Silas fired back, a calm, measured shot aimed at a muzzle flash. A cry of pain answered him. He worked the rifle's lever, his movements fluid and economical, a terrible muscle memory taking over. He was a good man now, but he was using the skills of a bad one to prove it. For an hour, the battle raged, a chaotic symphony of gunfire, splintering wood, and the howling of the wind. A lantern was hit, plunging half the room into darkness. But in the heart of the violence, a strange calm settled over Silas. He was no longer afraid. He was where he was supposed to be, defending the only thing that had ever mattered. The frontal assault had failed. The gunfire quieted, but the silence that followed was more menacing. Silas knew Ronan. This wasn't over. Ronan wasn't a man for sieges, he was a man for grand, cruel gestures. A smell reached him first, acrid and sharp. Pine resin and oil. He looked at Ilara, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Fire, they were trying to burn them out. A flicker of orange light licked up the side of the cabin wall. Then another. The flames caught on the dry logs, fed by the relentless wind. The howling outside was now matched by the roar of the fire. Smoke began to fill the small space, stinging their eyes, choking their lungs. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Silas's throat. They were trapped. Ronan's laughter, manic and triumphant, carried over the din. Come on out, ox. Come out and watch your new life turn to ash. Silas looked at Ilara. Her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were fixed on him, unwavering. In them, he saw not surrender, but a terrifying resolve. They would die here together. But then he looked at the floorboards, at the cellar where Leo was hidden. No. He wouldn't allow that ending. He made a decision. It was the only one left. When I open the door, he said, his voice a hoarse command, you run. Take the boy. Run for the woods and don't look back. No, she gasped, grabbing his arm. Saul, no. He gripped her shoulders, his large hands gentle. He looked at her, really looked at her, memorizing the fierce beauty of her face. You gave me a home, Ilara. Let me defend it. Before she could argue, he kissed her. It was a desperate, hurried thing, tasting of smoke, fear, and a love that had never been spoken. Then he shoved the Navy Colt into her hand. For protection he turned to the door, the heavy bar all that stood between them and the inferno. He took a deep breath, the smoke searing his lungs. He was no longer Silas the gentle giant or Saul the broken killer. He was a sacrifice. He ripped the bar away and kicked the door open, stepping out into a world of fire and snow. He bellowed Ronan's name, a raw, animal sound of pure defiance. He was the target. The only target. And as he raised his rifle, he prayed Ilara would run. He filled the frame of the burning doorway like a legend, a great, dark beast wreathed in flame. The remaining men, startled by his sudden appearance, raised their weapons. Silas fired first, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. A man fell. He fired again. Another. He was a force of nature, a being of pure, focused will, drawing all the violence onto himself. Behind him, he heard the scrape of the cellar door. He heard Ilara's choked sob. He didn't dare look back. His focus was on the figure who now stepped out from behind a tree, a cruel smile on his face. Ronan. He was leaner than Silas remembered, his eyes holding the cold, dead light of a viper. "Look at you, Ox," Ronan sneered, raising his own pistol. "Playing householder. It doesn't suit you." A bullet tore through Silas's shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted, pain exploding through him, but he stayed on his feet. He could feel the heat of the cabin fire on his back, a funeral pyre at his heels. He saw a flicker of movement near the woods, Ilara, a small bundle in her arms, disappearing into the blizzard's white embrace. She had made it. A wave of profound relief washed over him, extinguishing the pain. Now he could finish this. He charged. It was not a calculated move. It was the desperate, final act of a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He closed the distance between them, a wounded bull intent on goring his tormentor. Ronan fired again, the bullet catching Silas in the leg. He stumbled but didn't fall. He crashed into Ronan, his weight and momentum carrying them both to the ground. They rolled in the snow, a tangled mass of hatred and history. Silas's hands found Ronan's throat. Ronan struggled, his face purpling, his eyes wide with shock. He had expected the broken, ashamed man. He got the ox, fueled by a love he could never comprehend. The world began to grey at the edges for Silas. The fire, the snow, the pain, it was all fading. With the last of his strength, he squeezed. There was a final, faint crackle from the burning cabin, and then a profound silence, broken only by the whisper of the falling snow. The thaw came slowly, tentatively, as if afraid to wake the wounded land. The snow receded, revealing the scorched earth where the cabin had stood. Amid the blackened ruins, a new structure was rising. It was smaller, rougher, built from fresh-cut pine that still smelled of sap and life. Abe had brought lumber from town, his tribute paid in silence and sweat. Other townsfolk, shamed into action, had helped. The prank had ended in fire and death, but from its ashes, something was being born. Silas lay on a cot inside the half-finished walls, drifting in and out of a fevered sleep. Ilara had found him in the snow, near death, and had dragged him to the shelter of Abez Forge. For weeks, she had been his anchor to the world, cleaning his wounds, forcing broth between his lips, her presence a constant, silent promise. Her face was the first thing he saw when he finally woke, his mind clear. The winter in her eyes had retreated. In its place was the soft, green light of a coming spring. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He simply looked at her, and she understood. One afternoon, as he sat propped against the wall, watching her work, Leo approached him. The boy had been a quiet shadow, watching him with his wide, solemn eyes. He stopped before Silas and held out his hand. In his small palm was the carved wooden bird. He placed it gently on Silas's blanket. Then, he looked at Silas, his small face serious, and spoke his first word. A word that was not Mama, not Ilara, but a name. Silas, the name he had chosen for his new life. The name she had given him back. The sound was quiet, fragile, but it landed with the force of a revelation. It broke the last of the silence. It healed the last of the wounds. Ilara froze, her hands full of linen. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. A real, brilliant smile that transformed her, chasing away the last of the shadows. Silas reached out, his hand trembling, and laid it on the boy's head. A found family. A broken man, a grieving woman, and a silent child, brought together by a cruel joke. They had faced the fire and had not been consumed. They had endured the winter and had survived. He looked from the boy to Ilara, his heart full of a feeling so profound he had no name for it. The snow was melting. The sun was warm on his face. He was home.